Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Newly elected leaders on the state and federal level are looking to improve government efforts to help victims of Hurricane Helene. The devastating storm caused roughly $60 billion in wreckage in North Carolina, damaging more than 70,000 homes in the western part of the state. Many victims say relief is taking too long. Now, new elected leaders, including President Donald Trump and North Carolina Governor Stein, are promising to speed things up. WRAL state government reporter Will Doran has been tracking recovery efforts, and he joins us now. Will, welcome back.
Good to see you again.
Will, lawmakers returned to Raleigh to get an update on Hurricane Helene relief efforts. Give us a quick breakdown of the scope of the damage and where things are in terms of recovery.
Yeah, the scope of the damage is really hard to overstate. Like you said, $60 billion worth of damage to western North Carolina. And just to put that in perspective, the most damaging hurricane in North Carolina history before this was Hurricane Florence in 2018. That did like $17 billion worth of damage. So we're talking, multiple orders of magnitude worse than the previous record-breaking storm. It's just catastrophic, the amount of damage that we've seen. And adding to that is the fact that so many homes, business owners out in West North Carolina didn't have flood insurance because they didn't think they needed it. And so compared to places out east where, yes, there will be a lot of devastation from hurricanes in eastern North Carolina, a lot of times insurance companies can cover a lot of the costs without the government having to step in. That's not really the case. So we're really looking at this confluence of, one, a massive, massive amount of damage, and two, the private industry, the insurance companies, not really being on the hook for a lot of that, and the government being on the hook for a much higher percentage in addition to a higher total cost than you've normally got.
And to give us a sense of how long it will take to recover from Helene, we're still going through recovery efforts for Florence and also Hurricane Matthew, right?
Yes. Every state lawmaker you talk to, Democrat or Republican, has acknowledged, look, Helene recovery is going to be measured in years, not months. But what they want to avoid is what you just mentioned, the Florence and the Matthew situation, because those are storms, like I said, Hurricane Florence was in 2018, Hurricane Matthew was in 2016, nearly a decade ago, and we're still trying to get people's houses rebuilt from that storm. And that has been a huge problem. We've done documentaries about that here at WRAL. We've covered that for years. It was a really big political liability for former Governor Roy Cooper. What people don't want to do is that nearly decade-long recovery process, but they're saying, let's try to finish this up in a few years, but not, 7, 8, 9 years.
Now, lawmakers have already approved about $1 billion in state funding for Helene. How much more is needed, and where will the money come from?
Yes, $60 billion total. The state has set aside about $1 billion so far. So obviously just a drop in the bucket, but no one expects the state government to cover all of these costs. In fact, no one really expects all of these costs to be fully covered. There's just kind of a general acknowledgement that many billions of dollars in damage are just going to have to be eaten by the property owners. The federal government will probably put in a pretty decent chunk. The state government is still working this out, figuring out exactly how much they're going to pay. But because the federal government is expected to pay a whole lot more, state officials are kind of still waiting on the feds to say, one, how much they're going to spend, and two, what they're going to spend it on before the state can kind of come in and fill the gaps.
Now, Governor Stein, who was inaugurated about a month ago, has taken some action to reboot recovery efforts for Helene. Tell us about that.
Yes, Josh Stein, second day in office, his first action as governor, signed, I think it was 5 different executive orders on Hurricane Helene-related efforts. One of them was creating an entire new state agency to handle the rebuilding. And that's because of what I was just talking about, the just awful delays after Florence and Matthew that were done by the state's main office for hurricane recovery called Rebuild NC. And, Stein didn't directly say this, but the message was clear that, hey, they've screwed that up. I don't want anything to do with that group. We're going to let them continue to exist, finish doing the work that they say they are pretty close to being finished with. But for Helene, we're going to get a whole new group of people, whole new leadership structure, a whole new strategy in place to handle this new rebuild effort. And so that was one of his big efforts. He also, loosened some regulations to help bring in trailers, for instance, for people out in Western North Carolina who, probably are going to have to wait a little while for their homes to get rebuilt because, the federal money is still kind of in a holding pattern on that. There's been some complaints that a lot of those trailers, even though we have since brought them in, are sitting around unused. Some lawmakers talked about that this week. Heard that there's actually not a ton of demand for it from people in Western North Carolina, which actually could be a good sign. Even if people have been forced out of their homes, they've at least found some sort of stable living relationship, whether that's with, friends or family or what have you. So a little bit of good news on that front. But Stein definitely wanting to make a statement, making, his first actions as governor to be focused on Helene. And then he's been out in Western North Carolina a ton just in the month that he has been governor. It feels like at least once a week, maybe twice, he's been out in Western North Carolina. Of course, President Trump came to Western North Carolina as well. There's still a lot of attention here. People have not forgotten about this storm, even though it was, already several months ago and several disasters ago.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear what President Trump is saying about the federal response to Helene. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran about Hurricane Helene recovery efforts. Will, shortly after President Trump was inaugurated, as you mentioned before the break, he made a trip to Western North Carolina. Has he made any promises related to recovery efforts there?
Yes, he has said that he wants it to be more streamlined and faster than it has been, and that's not just in relation to Western North Carolina and Helene, but everything. He has proposed just getting rid of FEMA entirely and essentially just having the federal government send money directly to the states. And that was actually one thing that North Carolina has run into with, as we've mentioned, the slow recovery from Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. While the Cooper administration got a lot of blame from the state legislature for that, what Cooper and his folks said was, look, okay, yes, we'll acknowledge that we've had some of our own issues, but also we've just been waiting around for FEMA to get us this money, and we have to jump through all of these hoops for FEMA. And so, there could be some bipartisan support to this idea of getting rid of FEMA. Now, that's obviously not something that the president can just do unilaterally. That would have to pass through Congress. But if he can come up with, a plan that has some actual details on how it would work, and, I think one thing that a lot of state leaders would be wanting to see is, make sure that the amount of federal funding that they could expect to receive after natural disasters wouldn't go down with this effort to cut FEMA. And, who knows? I mean, if we're, laying off thousands and thousands of federal government employees who currently work for FEMA, maybe some of the money that goes to states could actually go up. But we don't have any of those actual details yet from President Trump on what his, idea is to reform that system going forward. There's just kind of a general desire to make some sort of change.
Now, beyond the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, Trump has been focused on freezing funding across government. Will that effort slow relief to Western North Carolina?
Yes. So President Trump signed this executive order recently that basically shut down not all, but much of the government's grants and other funding programs. And it was done in a way with not a whole lot of detail or instruction that people weren't really sure what to make of it. And so what actually happened was the FEMA aid portal that, Western North Carolina has been using post-Helene shut down after he signed that order, and the money dried up totally. So, everyone started freaking out saying, so do we not get money anymore for Helene recovery, for, Matthew and Florence recovery? And then the next day, a judge blocked Trump's order and the FEMA aid portal went back online. Now, we've heard from some Republicans in our congressional delegation that certainly Trump didn't mean to shut down FEMA, even if that is what happened. This is just kind of an issue where no one is really sure what exactly this order would do or intended to do. So far, it hasn't really done anything since it's now been blocked in court. But if it does come back, if the courts do allow it to go back into place, there is a serious concern, mostly among Democrats, that it will shut down FEMA and HUD and some other agencies that have been funding the recovery efforts. We've heard from Republicans that, sounds like they'll press the White House pretty hard to make sure that it doesn't happen. Even if that was Trump's original intent, we don't really know what Trump's original intent with this was. We just know what the effects have been.
Now, North Carolina Congressman Tim Moore has been paying particular attention to this. He was recently named to a council that's reviewing the operations of FEMA. He recently addressed that Fiscal Balancing Act, cutting federal spending while ensuring aid was still flowing to the state. What did he have to say?
Yes, Moore is in this delicate position where he is a Republican member of Commerce. He's the former Speaker of the State House, now in D.C. in Congress, trying to toe the Republican line on we need to make spending cuts, but also trying to represent his constituents here in Western North Carolina and say we need more money for disaster relief. So that's a tricky place to be in. But he did an interview recently with our Ashley Rowe where he talked about these efforts, and he acknowledged, yes, there is going to be some tightening of the belt, was the phrase that he used. But in general, he thinks that the people of Western North Carolina will not be fully left behind by the federal government, that money will still be coming through, even if it looks different or is, slightly less or delivered in a different way. Again, a lot of these details are still kind of up in the air. We don't really know how the federal government is going to change how it delivers this money.
The federal government is also having to juggle other priorities in addition to Helene. It's also dealing with these unprecedented wildfires in California. How could that affect relief efforts here? Is that going to stretch the dollars?
It certainly could. In general, there's the saying that, money doesn't grow on trees, but the U.S. government is kind of the exception to that rule. We can just print money at the federal level if we want to. Now, there could be some political backlash to, an increased federal deficit to spend more money on disaster relief. But we've also just seen more and more natural disasters in recent years. And so, will the feds kind of take this opportunity right now with Helene hitting not only Florida, but, a bunch of other red states, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee as well. And then, also blue states like out in California with these wildfires. Will the feds take this opportunity to say, hey, we need to rethink how we handle disaster relief, maybe put a lot more money in the future into disaster relief? Or is it going to be kind of, states scrambling for, money from this pot that is not going to really change? So we don't know how that's going to be affected yet. There's also been calls for treating some states differently when it comes to disaster relief and, saying that, okay, we're going to need political concessions, say from California before, the Trump administration agrees to give them money. We actually saw some disagreement from our own U.S. senators here in North Carolina. Tom Tillis and Ted Budd had kind of different reactions to that idea of conditioning disaster relief aid under the Trump administration to California because, if you set a precedent on that, then what happens in a future Democratic presidency when a red state gets in an emergency? So, even among the Republican Party, there's different levels of appetite for doing things like that. Again, very early, just going to have to watch and see how that all plays out.
Now, state lawmakers are ramping up a new legislative session. Is there any sense of if or when they might approve more Helene funding?
They're going to approve more Helene funding. The question is just how much and, again, when that happens. And it also comes with a complication, which we've mentioned, the Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew issue. The state's leader of those efforts testified in front of the legislature recently, and he said that they need another $200 million to finish those efforts. There's still around over 1,000 people from those storms who are waiting to get back in their houses. And he said, we can get all of these people back into their homes by the end of 2025 if you give me another $217 million. And now the state has already spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and legislators were not happy to hear that when Prior Gibson said that to them during this testimony, because if they want to do that, that's $200 million that they can't spend on Helene. But they've also spent years hammering the lack of action on Florence and Matthew and how big of a problem it is. So do they kind of give up on that and focus more money on Helene? Do they try to get all of the Eastern North Carolina people taken care of first since they've been waiting longer? Do they try to, come somewhere in the middle, find a nice middle ground? That is a big issue they're going to have to figure out. And then The issue also becomes, how do you do this money? Do you roll it into the main state budget that we know from past experience probably isn't going to become law, if it becomes law at all, until July, August, even September? Or do you do a separate Helene bill soon and see if you can get something passed by like February or March instead of waiting until the summer or the fall with the state budget? So, a lot of strategic questions there politically, as well as strategic questions there on how much do you fund and which type of storm relief gets attention.
Well, whatever happens, we know you're going to be reporting on it. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran for our latest on disaster relief funding. Go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.